how dare a medical student have an opinion?
Ask a physician what would improve care, and they'll tell you a faster horse, not a car. I like his writing. Aditya Jain, a Harvard medical student, wrote this op-ed at Doximity titled, "Why I Didn't Apply to Residency and What I'm Doing Instead." Not long ago, my fellow HMS students and I took a field trip to Boston Scientific's headquarters in Marlborough, Massachusetts, and it was about translational biomedical engineering for those students who are interested in bringing medical innovation from benchside to bedside. They heard from company leaders, including physicians who had left practice, on how medical training intersects with medical technology innovation. And of course, once that is a throwaway, we still need people to become physicians. We need data to train the AI. And a few chuckled. I wondered if only I felt the uncertainty and tension in the room. So of course, a large premise of this argument as to why he's not going to residency seems to be focusing around AI and how that's going to be transforming medicine in the future. And he makes a great point here, which is that everyone talks about AI changing the world, including medicine, but then they just keep doing what they're doing as if AI is not going to disrupt and change these various industries. And he says the reason why is because of this gravity to the medical training pathway. Because by the time you're an MS4, a fourth year medical student, you've already given at least 8 years of your life. That's 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school. You've taken on significant student loan debt, and you've organized your entire identity around a single destination because med school takes so much of your time, effort, and focus. And you are, by every external perception, almost there. As you graduate, you get your MD, then you start your residency, and the sunk cost fallacy never felt so rational. Can totally see that. I mean, I was there. I had very strong sunk cost fallacy as I was deciding to leave plastic surgery residency. But he's finding it hard to justify residency. And in this essay, he's going to explain why he did not apply to residency, what that reveals about the changing value of clinical training in this era of AI, and how AI is going to disrupt things. So I'm very interested in this, and we're also going to explore some of the responses from other doctors in the Doximity comments as well. So he talks about a patient that arrives with diarrhea, and there's this tool that's going to actually generate a differential diagnosis, suggest some tests, draft a note. And it's actually the experience he used with Counsel Health, an AI platform, with an uninsured patient a few weeks prior to writing this. And he's pointing out to a very real thing, which is that cognitive core of medicine, the history taking, the pattern recognition, differential diagnosis, treatment selection, and so on and so forth, is being automated, and AI is going to get better and better at this. And he makes the argument that the standard investment case for residency is a matter of you start this 3 to 7 year training process, but you're investing in expertise that compounds over a 50-year career. Yes, you accumulate debt. Well, by the time you hit residency, you're not accumulating more debt except for the interest on your already existing loans, and it depends on what your payments are during residency, et cetera, et cetera. But he's saying that in the era of AI, the payoff is no longer the same, because as AI's capabilities grow, the economic value of the cognitive skills that a human physician is building, it just gets smaller and smaller with time. So AI is making intelligence too cheap to meter, per OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. I actually want to come back to that quote. And when AI is cheap, robotics is not far behind. We actually have a whole video talking about AI physician robots, which you can find linked right up here, talking about Elon Musk's argument about that. So a few things here. Number one, the whole tinidazole example with the diarrhea patient, it does feel a little bit cherry picked because it is a very simple clinical encounter. And obviously AI is going to get better and better, but you're very much painting the best case scenario about AI really being able to do a lot of things that doctors were previously doing. Number two, the whole idea of just like pressing the approve button. I mean, it's going to carry malpractice exposure, right? So DEA registration, billing authority, hospital credentialing, state licensure, all these things. And all that's going to flow through residency and the training that you have in residency and the decision making you can only make after doing a residency. So it's not like the doctor just graduates med school and just like rubber stamps and everything is good. If you have accountability and liability, then you do need to have the training to back that. And I think that there is a conflation of capability with deployment, because the capability of AI and a lot of these things is very impressive and can do all these things that we couldn't have imagined X number of years ago. I mean, ChatGPT 4 could have done a lot of these primary care visits years ago, but it's not, right? Because there's so much regulation and actual deployment and ensuring that the standard is not just as good as a doctor, it has to be even better, right? We need to have smaller, tighter margins. How do we handle the legislation? How do we handle the liability? And all these complexities in the bureaucracy that is modern healthcare in the US. And this quote of too cheap to meter, that It's actually an interesting quote because it's actually a Lewis Strauss quote from 1954 about nuclear electricity. And he was essentially telling you that electricity is going to become so cheap that it's going to be too cheap to even meter. But obviously, if you guys look at your electric bill, that's not really the case. And Sam Altman is essentially adopting that for AI, how it's going to get cheaper and cheaper with time as technology improves. But I mean, we'll see, I guess. It will definitely get cheaper, but I don't think it's going to be too cheap to meter. In the same way with nuclear energy and modern electricity, it's not too cheap to meter. We do have to be mindful of who is saying these things and what are their incentives, right? Of course, Sam Altman is going to want you to be as fully aligned into the AI future as possible. He's the CEO, OpenAI, right? So again, not here to like be difficult and argue against everything he's saying, but just trying to add balance and therefore choosing, being the devil's advocate, if you will. Some other things to consider as to what residency gives you. It's not just having some medical knowledge, but there are multiple other doors and avenues that are now open to you. So consulting, medical directorships, clinical AI companies, biotech policy, the list goes on, right? Most require these credentials as table stakes. And you can walk away from clinical practice after you take your boards, but you can't necessarily walk back in, right? Now, I'm not here to say that residency is this great, amazing thing that I don't think needs massive overhaul, because residency is simply cheap labor disguised as a training modality, and it's primarily about cheap labor, less about training. It's all the scut work, all the nonsense you have to do that you're not going to actually do as a practicing physician. If it was optimized just for training, learning, and making the best future doctors, it would look very different than how it looks right now, but that's a topic for another video. Now, doctors won't disappear in his lifetime, but they might just be customer service reps with liability, and patients may not mind because they're already turning to AI due to frustrations with care. And a systematic review of 15 studies. I think that's the 2023 systematic review that he's referring to. That was in JAMA Internal Medicine. That patients actually consistently find AI responses to be more empathetic and satisfying than human physicians. And sometimes even physicians agree in some cases. That is concerning, right? This is valid, legitimate research. And what we have to ask is why. Why is it that patients are feeling this way and preferring AI and finding it more empathetic than real human doctors? I mean, how wild, right? We've all been using AI a lot more since 2023, and it can be a bit of a sycophant, and it can, maybe not hard to imagine, but I think the reason why patients are not finding doctors to always be as empathetic, and I'm a patient myself, I have my own chronic autoimmune condition, and I've had issues with some of my own doctors, right? It's oftentimes because they're just spread so thin, right? They're burned out, they're double booked, they have 10 minutes, 15 minutes tops for an appointment. And if doctors were not in this state, if they had more time, if they weren't constantly spread thin, then I think most of the doctor-patient interactions would look quite different. The standard defense of residency is that you can't really understand medicine without living it. The hours are the point. The 10,000 hour rule is a popular concept that says that when you're mastering a skill, like becoming a world-class musician, it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. But deliberate is the key word here. I love that. And the time spent by a resident admitting the fifth weak and dizzy patient at 4 a.m. probably doesn't fall into the category of deliberate practice. Not because residents aren't working hard, but because deliberate practice is focused, feedback-rich, and corrective. In reading about medical education and talking to resident friends, it appears that most of what residents do is service. With 80-hour weeks, residency is not primarily a learning program. It is an endurance program that also contains learning. Endurance is in and of itself a valuable skill in medicine, but AI does not need tenacity, only electricity. This so far is my favorite paragraph because, yeah, I am totally aligned. Again, residency is not about teaching people how to be amazing doctors. It is about scut work. It is cheap labor. It is about endurance, as he's talking about. It's unfortunate. It actually reminds me of this other reaction video I did to a TEDx talk. You can find that right up here. That covers this in a lot more detail, really expands on that. And if there's at least one thing that we fix and improve with AI, of course, the patient outcomes, the care, etc. Can we also just fix our medical training process, please? On rounds, residents stepping back from broken workflows, really wanting someone else to figure this out, moving on to the next patient because, yeah, they're just so spread thin. Residency doesn't teach you to look at physiology and ask whether there's a better way. It teaches you to execute existing protocols excellently. True, and oftentimes some of the greatest innovations, for those who don't know, in my prior lifetime, I was working on this biomedical incubator that helped people create healthcare startups. And oftentimes outsiders with curiosity can actually drive innovation more so than the experts who are already in it. Because when you're already in it, you're already doing surgery day in and day out, you don't think, why is it done this way? You actually just assume this is the way it's done because this is the way it's done and this must be the best way. When you have fresh eyes and you look at something, as the medical student, as the resident, and so on, then you are actually in a better position to ask, is there a better way? And you can actually innovate from that. Really counterintuitive, right? You may think, oh, the surgeon is the one with the most experience who would be best suited for this. Actually, it's usually the opposite. These are different skills, and optimizing hard for one can actively suppress the other. Nobel laureates and business founders have a phrase for this: you're the only one crazy enough to do it. Now, what this makes me first think of is, of course, survivorship bias, because for every Nobel laureate or founder who followed that advice, there's, of course, hundreds or thousands who were confidently wrong. Now, of course, most VC-backed founders fail and most startups die. And I just want to call that out. At the same time, the author of this article is, clearly a very smart, brilliant guy that has, he's at HMS, he's already in Broad, and like, this guy's going places. So, you bet on the jockey, not the horse kind of thing. And, he seems like the kind of person who's going to figure this out. But I think what I'm seeing so far is that this is more of an argument as to why he is not doing residency, but not necessarily that residency is less of a optimal path for most people. It's like, he's this smart, entrepreneurial minded guy who is going to do other things and is already very well situated. Much more so than most other med students. Consider radiology, one of medicine's most purely cognitive specialties. On Radiology's last exam benchmark, board certified radiologists score 83%, radiology residents are at 45%, and that represents the 4 to 5 years of intensive training in residency. And at the time that he published this, Google's Gemini 2.5 model scored 30%, but by January 2026, Gemini 3.0 Pro, the generalist AI model not trained on radiology, scored a 51%. That's 27 percentage points of improvement in 12 months. A human radiology resident improves roughly 8 to 10 percentage points per year at the cost of 60 to 80-hour work weeks, mental exhaustion, and delayed life milestones. At current rates, AI available to the general population, not even the specialized stuff, but just the general AI, will match board-certified radiologists well before I would finish a radiology residency. And unlike human expertise, which plateaus, AI improvement appears to be exponential. That's actually a very interesting way of looking at it. The 45% for the residents, the 83% talking about the 8 to 10% per year. I think that's an interesting take. In terms of the exponential improvement, there's the theoretical and the practical. When do we hit plateaus? How long do those plateaus last before the next inflection point with more growth? So keep that in mind. But again, keep in mind that the 83% here, that doesn't just immediately translate to being a radiologist, right? Even if the test is scoring 85% or 90% or 95%, radiologists aren't just reading images, they're integrating the clinical context, they're talking to the referring physicians, they're hedging appropriately, and it's not as simple to just replace them, right? Is it going to augment the radiologists and make it so that you need fewer radiologists to do the same amount of work? Sure, I actually very much do believe that, and you can see the videos up here or linked below on, how I think AI is going to be changing radiology. We've even worked with a radiologist who specializes in AI research in radiology and made a video with him covering all those details over on the Med School Insider channel, which you can find linked below too. And when you look to the past, there are many technologies that did completely disrupt and put people out of jobs. You go from horse and carriage to the car, the automobile, right? And there are many other examples, but there's also many examples where the technology didn't just replace, but it helped to augment and change what the person is doing and actually creates more jobs too. But you see these AI companies, the AI scribes, the AI charting that he's talking about, those are extending and serving the doctor and improving the amount of work that they can do and not replacing them, but again, augmenting them. I came to medical school planning to be a physician, and I still remember my white coat ceremony where our dean explained Harvard's philosophy. In a world where great change is happening, the world expects me to be a great physician and scientist, physician and entrepreneur, and innovator, so on and so forth. But the more time I've spent on the track, the more clearly I see a structural problem. By the time you reach the and of physician and, you're 35, with a family, carrying debt, structurally risk-averse in ways that weren't true when you donned the coat. That's a really good point, and people don't realize how your life changes. When you are 25, you just think that life is going to be like that forever, but of course it won't. And your responsibilities and your risk tolerance will completely change by the time you're 35. I'm currently 35. And now I'm an old man that sleeps every day at 10 p.m. and wakes up at 5:30 and yells at the cloud and grows more ear hair and all the good things that come with that. Ask a physician what would improve care, and they'll tell you a faster horse, not a car. I like his writing. The window for the first principles high variance bets that meaningful innovation requires has closed. That might actually be my favorite sentence in the whole essay, the whole ask a physician what would improve care, and they'll tell you a faster horse, not a car. It's a complete shift in the model, right? Not about getting better. It's not incremental improvement. It's about complete transformation, a completely different paradigm. That is my favorite sentence in the whole essay so far, and definitely food for thought, right? What is this new paradigm going to be? And that's what he's pointing to in this essay. And I think that sentence just, it cuts real well. Going back to the age thing of innovation and risk, keep in mind that a lot of founders are actually, they're much older than 35 and they're successful. And oftentimes when you are older, you have more experience, expertise, and understanding of the system that you are trying to change and improve and innovate in, rather than having to be young, risk-taking, and breaking things along the way. There are pros and cons to each approach, but don't think that you only have to be in your 20s and, oh my God, I'm 35, I can never innovate again. I don't think that's true. And in fact, I would say when it comes to like durable healthcare innovation, I think oftentimes it's coming from those who are more experienced, because there is so much happening, there's so much complexity that the young innovator trying to disrupt is usually just hits a wall and hits a wall and hits another wall again and again, with all the bureaucracy, the regulations, the complexity, the things that sometimes not knowing enough helps you innovate, but sometimes not knowing enough can actually hold you back too. Next steps for med students. Most helpful piece of advice is to maximize the time spent doing what matters. If seeing patients one by one every day is what makes life feel meaningful to you, do residency. We need excellent physicians. We need clinicians who will manage the transition. And if you can't stomach it, we need physicians who can train AI. I would not argue for anyone who finds real meaning in direct patient care to walk away from that. I come from a family and Jain culture where knowledge is considered the highest value. I was internally motivated by learning long before I thought about medicine, and medical school satisfied that need. Learning physiology, pathophys, and clinical reasoning would not change these last 5 years, but 4 more years of executing on what I have learned without the bandwidth to build or question is not enough for me and enough for the moment we're in. So instead of residency, he is staying in the healthcare world, but doing some tech stuff. He's founding a company in his vision of a predictive healthcare system, the entire business model of medicine, insurance as catastrophe coverage, reimbursement as post-hoc payment, care delivery as reactive response, was architected around an unquestioned truth: we cannot predict who gets sick or when. The new era of abundant intelligence gives us the tools to try. My MD gave me the foundation to do this work seriously, with the understanding of risk and benefit, the vocab to work with regulators and payers, and the clinical experience that maintains urgency. Most of all, it gave me a guiding star, using health to improve people's health and life itself. Medicine is changing now. The question is whether we spend years preparing for a world that's already disappearing or participate in changing the world. I choose the latter. Very interesting read. And Aditya, thanks for sharing this. You know, even if I don't agree with everything, and I think many people are going to have their own things they're going to push back on, it's at least a very thoughtful and well-written piece. So I think the world would actually be a much better place if we had more thoughtful discourse and not just reactive social media nonsense. And I really like this first paragraph of his conclusion, because he's saying it's not that residency is no longer valuable, but for him, it is less valuable than the alternative. And again, this guy, brilliant dude doing some innovation. He's already well connected, Harvard and the Boston area, MIT, innovation, etc. Like, based on his interest, his skill set, and where he wants to go, I think it does seem to make sense for him not to do residency, right? But he's saying that that's not going to be the case for others. And I would argue that for the overwhelming majority, obviously, you should definitely do residency. And I like him giving us that perspective and the framing of his own personal reasons with the Jain culture, family tradition, pursuing knowledge. And that's actually very helpful, I think, to frame the overall essay. Now, part of me is cautiously optimistic about this too, but just keep in mind that, predictive healthcare it's been done many times before. Granted, we have new technology now, but there are many people who have tried this. There will be many more people who will be trying this. I wish him luck, but it's not something that is cutting edge new idea and totally going to work out, right? It is a risky thing, and we'll see. He's a sharp guy. We'll see what he does and what kind of changes he makes. All right, so my thoughts on the overall piece. I think that he's directionally right on a lot of his takes. I think residency does have massive real problems, as we covered elsewhere, and cognitive work is getting commodified to some extent. And with the timing of where AI is right now and medicine's deployment curves being less than speedy, there's a lot of room for disruption and improvement here. And in fact, I probably agree with him a lot more than the overall Doximity comment section, which we'll get to next. But again, his alternative is a little bit vague right now. Let's see what he's going to do with his startup. And again, he's at Harvard. He's plugged into the Broad ecosystem. He has real AI research experience. And if anyone's going to pull off that founder pivot from med school, like he seems pretty well equipped. And that's why this applies to him and the 99th percentile med student, not to the 50th percentile med student. And it's good that he's not generalizing that to others. Eugene Ross, who's an ENT, first sentence, we're being lectured by a medical student, not a seasoned professional. This is exactly the vibe I was expecting in the comments, which is that
how dare a medical student have an opinion?
It's really like the purest distillation of medicine's incredibly conservative and reactionary defensiveness to anything that pushes back against the norm. Yeah, calling it failure to fulfill his duty to the profession and the enormous investment made in him and failure of the admissions committee. Oh my God. I'm surprised this comment is upvoted as much as it is. I'm quite disappointed in it. And this person doesn't understand the medical training process. Eugene, if a med student doesn't complete residency, I hope you realize that there are many more medical student graduates than there are residency positions, and therefore you don't actually lose a doctor in that process. And this whole like, I've been a doctor for 49 years, credentialism is not helpful to an argument. It's essentially a way to argue when you don't have anything important to say. And even the framing here of, using the word failure however many times. This is why I don't like social media, and I don't like the lack of nuanced discussion that actually moves the conversation forward. This reflexive and like very sardonic and it's exhausting. And the whole thing that like Aditya owes the profession something. I mean, he paid for med school, right? He earned his seat, and he doesn't owe the profession anything. And that framing to not do residency as some kind of moral failure and a betrayal of this enormous investment is very much that like guild protection mindset that gave us and 80-hour work weeks and other issues with medicine. Benjamin Wise, 2 years in residency, it's a scam, and I loathe the job while loving the work. That is really interesting. Because while residency has real problems, he's pointing to the fact that the work itself has true meaning, right? Both of these things can be true. They're not mutually exclusive. Benjamin Wise here, I think, has a very thoughtful comment. I'd love to see more comments like this. But there are some things that I want to point out. One thing that I think is kind of ironic is the argument that Benjamin Wise is saying here is that tech is only as good as the people controlling it. That's actually the best case for having more doctors that are shaping tech companies and the future of AI, right? Because the modern mess of EHR and optimizing for billing is what happens when you don't have enough physicians in the room. So if Aditya's pivot produces more clinically grounded and better suited AI, that's actually a win for patients. It's not a loss, right? But I love the closing statement on this comment. But it's your life, so just go out there and do no harm. I think we'll end on that note. Much love, my friends, and I'll see you in that next one.